so much, Rebecca, for that warm introduction and for having me and bringing this event to life. I'm very excited to be here. And thank you to the American Jewish Historical Society for having me today. I'm excited to share this virtual space with all of you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Okay. So I became fascinated with crypto-Jewish history and memory in the Southwest in somewhat of a roundabout way. I began by studying Hebrew poetry in Muslim medieval Spain and fell in love with the poetry, and then spent some time living and working in Spain and became interested in how Spain was remembering and memorializing its Jewish history. And then I traveled to the Southwest to do some research following one part of the Sephardic diaspora from the Iberian Peninsula to the New World, and found a wealth of materials in the archive of crypto-Jewish voices reclaiming and re-narrating their place in history and in the complex landscape of identity in New Mexico, all the way from the colonial period to recent decades. And I also found that across the 20th century, scholars had approached this history often through a lens of authenticity, through attempts to discover material threads of continuity, or through a determination to sequester Sephardic identity in the Southwest into a category distinct and separate from other identities essential to the land and history of the region, including Chicanx and indigenous identities. As historian Maria Elena Martinez writes in an essay on limpieza de sangre, which we'll talk about more later, or purity of blood, racial violence and gendered power in early colonial Mexico, arriving at definitive conclusions about what transpired is ultimately less important than comprehending the historical and cultural context that made certain phenomena or identity constructions possible, at least in the eyes and imaginations of those who described them. And so I approach this past with an emphasis on how and why community members have identified themselves in certain ways over time, and how they have reconstructed identities from a fragmented record. Left with an archive filled with absences, my historical and poetic works aim to preserve silences while uncovering and bolstering the voices and imaginations of those both erased and held within the silences of the archive. And so my comparative work often begins with and is guided by memory. Crypto-Jewish identity begins with the creation of Sepharad, a geographic entity of the 9th century that served as a site of Jewish cultural identity formation. First mentioned in the Bible in the book of Obadiah, Sepharad became synonymous with Spain by the Middle Ages and was a site of both cultural and religious harmony and violence between Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Though some forced conversions of Jews took place in the late 6th and early 7th centuries on the Iberian Peninsula, a wave of violence, of increased violence, post-1391, resulted in the widespread emergence of crypto-Judaism. In 1391, a year of many pogroms led to the murder or conversion of the majority of the Spanish Jewish population, and crypto-Judaism, which is both a secret religious practice, the preserving of traditions across generations, and a social group called conversos, or new Christians, emerged. In the 15th century, the enmity of many old Christians toward Jews shifted into a distrust of conversos, of these new Christians, who had impure racial lineages, culminating in the Spanish Inquisition around 1478. The decree of Alhambra, ordered by the Catholic monarchy in 1492, ordered all Jews who had not already converted to convert, or if they refused baptism, to be expelled. Hidden faith traveled through Jewish diaspora to the Ottoman Empire, to Europe, and to the Americas. And these are two images that I took while living in Spain on the left, and they're both instances of how Spain has memorialized, perhaps in insufficient ways, its history of religious persecution. On the left is Callejón de la Inquisición, or an alleyway where there was an office of the Inquisition. And on the right is Calle de la Judería Vieja, or a plaque that marks the Jewish quarter, as Jews and Muslim populations lived in their own separate quarters in Spain prior to their expulsion. And here we can see the global reach of the Spanish and Portuguese empires, and thus of the branches of the Inquisition, including a branch in Mexico, which was established in 1570, 1571. Converso conquistadores, or conquerors, fled to the new land, the New World, including Luis de Carvajal, a well-known crypto-Jew and governor who colonized the region of Nuevo León in 1571, the year that the Inquisition in Mexico began, and brought over many of his family members, some of whom were actively practicing crypto-Jews. And this is the front page of Carvajal's Mexican Inquisition trial from 1589, 18 years after he had arrived to Mexico City to be the colonial governor of Nuevo León. Most of Carvajal's family was later killed by the Mexican Inquisition, the branch of the Spanish Inquisition established in Mexico City in 1571, as I mentioned. The majority of Inquisition trials, or autos de fe, acts of faith, of crypto-Jews, because the Inquisition in Mexico City did not only try crypto-Jews, they also tried individuals for bigamy, for witchcraft, for economic, secular matters, for all sorts of acts of heresy or sin that went against the Spanish vision of a good Christian society. But the majority of crypto-Jewish trials, which occurred in the New World, took place during the 1580s to 90s and the 1640s. These trials of public penance demanded that crypto-Jews reconcile with the church and give up their properties. So we can see an economic motivation behind the Inquisition. The trials enumerated the core decrees of the Inquisition, emphasizing the statute of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood. Increased inquisitional presence in Mexico, along with colonial opportunity, pushed conversos north into the region which would become New Mexico. And while converso refers to immediate generations of converted Jews who may or may not have chosen to continue their Jewish practice, the term crypto-Jew refers to later descendants of conversos who chose to maintain and preserve aspects of their Jewish identity and religious tradition. And the term seems to have originated in the 20th century. Scholars have also employed the term marrano to refer to these communities, though the word in a Spanish, though not Portuguese context, is derogatory and translates loosely to pig, a forbidden food in Jewish tradition. Despite geographical distance from Mexico City, crypto-Jews continued to practice their religion secretly. A small number of individuals were brought from New Mexico to be tried by the Inquisition for heresy or Judaizing. Crypto-Judaism remained a hidden religion following Mexico's independence from Spain in 1821, though there is little evidence of crypto-Jewish practice or punishment available to researchers from the 19th century. Over the years, crypto-Judaism mixed with other cultural or religious practices, creating a multicultural and multi-religious set of traditions. Beginning in the 20th century, the late 20th century, and continuing into recent years, crypto-Jews in New Mexico and around the world have begun to reclaim aspects of their Jewish identity, tracing traditions back through usually maternal lines. And on this slide, on the left is a picture that I took in Segovia in Spain from the Jewish cemetery, which is at the outskirts of the city, and you have to traverse. I have a vague memory of a river. You traverse a lot of confusing land to reach the cemetery because it's very much outside of the main city. And on the right is a photo taken by photographer Carrie Hertz of a cemetery in New Mexico. She went around and took photos of several tombstones that she found in different cemeteries in which there was evidence of multi-religious traditions. So on this tombstone, there are Hebrew letters and then also a cross. On this slide is a poem written by crypto-Jew Isabel Medina Sandoval, which was published in a 1996 exhibition in New York, in which New Mexican poets, artists, and historians celebrated Sephardic Judaism's presence in the New World by means of the myth of Layaway, or the key. The myth claims that when Jews left the Iberian Peninsula during the 14th and 15th centuries, they took with them the keys to their homes in the hope that they would one day return. The keys perhaps no longer contain the hope of actual return, although some physical keys continue to be passed down through generations. But instead, Layaway today serves as a symbol of a lost homeland, nostalgically longed for, and an emblem of renewed Jewish and Sephardic identity for crypto-Jews in the Southwest. And we can see in this poem, the final stanza of Sandoval's poem, the Sephardim of Spain escaped with a hidden key, and I know deep in my bones that the same key was, and that now we have found the key to the sleeping neshama, or spirit or soul. In scholar Svetlana Boym's work on nostalgia, she writes that amongst exiles who can only imagine their homelands, nostalgia must rely on the sensual, on materiality of place, sensual perceptions, smells, and sounds. These sensations, latent in objects like Layaway, whether physical or imagined, transport an immigrant and her descendants to a past homeland. In photographer Carrie Hertz's book, New Mexico's Crypto-Jews, Image and Memory, which is the book that the tombstone is a part of, crypto-Jew Gloria Trujillo says about her Jewish identity, because it's a book of both photographs and some oral histories. She says, "The thing was that all along I had the key. I knew inside of me all my life, but I hadn't put it all together. The more I learned about my Jewish heritage, the more it all fits into place." As it does for the speaker in Sandoval's poem, the key not only transports Trujillo back to her geographic homeland, but it contains her innate tie, a bodily, spiritual tie to Judaism. So I approached these archives and the poems and words of women like Sandoval and Trujillo in my historical research to better understand how crypto-Jews in New Mexico were remembering and reconstructing their Sephardic and crypto-Jewish identities, and how these identities intersected and intersect both in the colonial period and in recent years with the ethnic, racial, and religious landscape of the Southwest. I was soon drawn to the materialities and memories of the archive itself, the textures of the papers, the way families' memories were organized into folders and boxes through scraps of newspapers, photos, poems, genealogies sketched on napkins, which I've encountered a few times. And so I began to write poems which emerged from my interaction with these archival sources. As the collection, Many to Remember, expanded, I began to reflect not only on the histories in front of me, but on the patterns and, importantly, ruptures I found between crypto-Jewish memory and my own family's memories of our different heritage. The poetry collection, which emerged from my research and reflections, weaves together archival sources, oral histories, and linguistic play in archival documents, encountering nostalgia, memory, and trauma in stories both distant from and near to my own. The project has led me to renewed and continual questions of genre, translation, and empathy, including how can the juxtaposition of old and new language reveal historical continuities and ruptures, or how does the language I'm creating interact with the language of these historical materials, of these archival sources, which sometimes date to the 16th century? Can poetry balance history and memory, weaving underrepresented voices into accepted narratives? And how can poetry translate the sensory and spiritual remnants of history, visible and latent in archival texts? As scholar Mary Carruthers notes in her work on medieval literature, a different topic, remembering is a visual act. This is a quotation, a matter of images etched into physical places in the brain. In other words, visuality enables recall. Poetry then, with all of its sensory capabilities, brings the past to life, brings memory to life multidimensionally. The words come into being like flowers. And that line is from Friedrich Hilderman, who was an 18th, 19th century German romantic poet. And I love that line. The words come into being like flowers. Minutiae, oddities, colors of a historical period emerge in the poetic line. poetry can foreground the materialities of history. In the Center for Southwest Research at the University of New Mexico, where I do a lot of my archival work, I learned that while in prison in Mexico City, Luis de Carvajal el Mozo, depicted here, who is the nephew of Luis de Carvajal, the governor of Nuevo León. This nephew is one of the crypto-Jewish family members that Carvajal brought over when he colonized Nuevo León. Luis de Carvajal el Mozo was a crypto-Jew who would later be executed for his sustained Jewish practices by the Mexican Inquisition. While he was in jail, he inscribed letters to his sisters, who were also in various jail cells, inside of fruits and vegetables. And what emerged from this discovery of mine in the archive was a poem which attempts to make sense of sensory pleasure, transmission, and creation amidst persecution and violence. The image of letters etched inside the flesh of fruits remained in my mind and remains at the center of the history as I articulate it in the poem. So I'll read Inquisition Letters, and I've put it on the screen in case with the Zoom format, it's sometimes easier to both see and hear, I think. Inquisition Letters. The legs put a lighthouse on the hill, the knees extended to form a tree. The world was created by feet padding through time. The tree that formed was very tall, the lighthouse white and cracked, tiles sent over with imprints by pigs' hooves to make them tried, the hooves and tiles. But some ran and didn't walk, and they cracked, the tiles and pigs. In the desert, the rain brings up salt, then soil. So following each storm, the farmers go out and water the earth back down. The ancient frail man is very virtuous and helps the farmers, calling bendita as they bend over their fields. The woman opens up as if land accepting water. The letters brought news like this. Words scratched on peach and avocado pits, wrapped in taffeta and hidden in melons, or wrapped in ribbons and pocketed inside banana's skin. The sweetest were meant for the jailed man's favorite, Doña Ana, or really his favorite of those close by. His best sister remained in a cell far away with a darker woman, unable to send pits or pears. Her hands traveled the wall each day, feigning engraving. A lute is playing softly, and its breeze is mixing with the light beneath her door. Everyone is wearing hats in the dark and counting their days with ticks on the palms of their hands, peaches all gone. And even as I'm reading, I'm thinking about in a cell far away with a darker woman, which is in these colonial records that Carvajal's favorite sister was far away and sharing a jail cell with someone who was described as dark, which emblematizes these sort of shared experiences of crypto-Jews with indigenous people, with Mexican people, who are also being tried for different crimes by the Mexican Inquisition. In this poem, one image engendered a world of mythology for me, as it seemed as likely that a religious prisoner would send words and prayers in the pits of peaches as it does that a body could slowly unfold and create the universe. Luis de Carvajal, in his stitched together autobiography, referred to himself as Joseph Lumbroso, or Joseph the Enlightened. His writings dwelled in prayer and mysticism and revealed an intention to transcend. As I mentioned before, the myth of Layaway, or the key, emerges in crypto-Jewish accounts of their cultural and religious inheritances. Flori Jagoda, a Bosnian American and Ladino-speaking Jewish musician, wrote a song, which I've put the sheet music on the screen, which addresses the myth, and the myth also appears in many crypto-Jewish stories and poems in the archive. And so I'll share now a poem which began with this myth, as well as with the idea I encountered of the swallow as a symbol of the expelled Jew in crypto-Jewish materials. And this poem is called The Myth of Layaway. The Myth of Layaway. Don't you see the swallows wilting in the sky, their wings fast asleep on their backs? The sparrow is fleeing, but the swallow is returning, golden key held between beak and neck. The old Spanish roads wind through graveyards and mountains, following train tracks as far as they will go. They do not mind disruption under their arcing bells, light traveling through padded and patched ground. The swallows are buried underneath, their wings tied to their bellies with string. The sparrows saw and hitched their babies to their backs. They are almost across the sea, but a yellow shadow in the water mirrors their path, and they are distracted, homesick for red earth and pink clouds. The light arcs back to the buried towns and resting birds who sit beneath the tracks. Except for a few, the sparrows cease fleeing, cling to shadow and turn. The swallows sigh and try to fold the earth more heavily over their heads. The myth of Layaway, interestingly, also appears in Spanish memory and has been used by Spanish officials since the 1940s to rewrite history. And on the screen is a relevant article from only a couple of months ago, from July of this year. In 2015, the Spanish government passed a law proposed by the People's Party, stating that those who can prove Sephardic ancestry can gain Spanish citizenship. A 2012 law proposed a similar opportunity, but with more restrictions. And recent news, very recent as highlighted here, has highlighted the new difficulties individuals have faced in completing the citizenship process. The rhetoric of the myth of Layaway and the desire to return, or the rhetoric of return, recurs in language from Spain's former Minister of Justice, Alberto Ruiz Gallardón, to, in recent years, to Spanish attempts at reconciliation in 1992, which was the quincentennial of 1492, the year of expulsion, in which President Chaim Herzog of Israel and King Juan Carlos of Spain symbolically prayed together in a synagogue in Madrid, and a Spanish declaration specifically emphasized the house keys taken by fleeing families 500 years before in 1492, who hoped to return one day to the peninsula, all the way to press releases from the 1940s, which noted that some Jews were accepted into Spain during the years of the Holocaust because of their archaic Spanish and ancient Spanish roots. In the 1940s, Spaniards saved a small number of Jews, the majority of whom were descendants of Sephardim, attempting to flee Hitler's territories. Ángel Sanz Briz, a Spanish diplomat during the Franco regime who saved thousands of Hungarian Jews, repeated this rhetoric of nostalgic return. Memorialized in countless books as a savior of the Jews, his story has been used as a substitute for examining Spanish action during World War II more generally. And we can look at Jacobo Israel Garzón's El Archivo Judaico del Franquismo from 1997 to read about the Jewish Archive, which was a list of 6,000 Jews who were living in Spain, created by the Franco regime and handed over to Nazi authorities in 1941. In 1949, Sanz Briz, the sort of mythologized figure, reflected on the Jewish refugees he encountered and said, "Sephardim hold on to many keepsakes of Spanish culture. Some even still own the keys to the homes that their great-great-grandfathers had to abandon 450 years ago." In his 1973 book, Spain and the Jews in the Second World War, commissioned by the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, commissioned by the government, Federico Isart presented Spain's humanitarian efforts during World War II. He wrote also about Layaway. There was not a family that did not know its exact lineage in the kingdom of Sepharad. So he sort of applies onto families that they have all kept track of this memory because of their innate connections to Spain. Many kept in their crammed storage spaces the keys to a distant home that would die with their memories. This language also recurs in a 1943 press release referring to Jews coming from Greece to Spain. In her 2014 book, Jewish Spain, A Mediterranean Memory, scholar Tabea Linhard argues that, and this is a quotation, writers and witnesses narrate instances of Jewish life in Spain's turbulent 20th century by invoking the remote past. The mythology of the imagined homeland by means of the myth of Layaway has served as a key actor in crypto-Jewish memory, as I've talked about, but also in policymaking and in Spanish national memory constructions. I'll just check. Okay. There has also been troubling memory work done by American scholars in the 1940s to recent decades of crypto-Jews living in the Southwest and Mexico, often tinged with Orientalist attitudes and sometimes descending directly from German Orientalist schools of thought and anthropological missions performed by German Jews to Mizrahi and Sephardic communities in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire in the 19th and 20th centuries. These accounts, done by American Jews, of the Marrano communities in the Americas still require unpacking and rewriting. As just one example, in a pamphlet from 1944, which is displayed here, I did some archival work at the American Jewish Historical Society, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And this pamphlet was just by chance the very first document I encountered while doing archival research. The pamphlet, and we have the front page of the pamphlet and then one page from the inside. The pamphlet was published by the American Friends of the Mexican Indian Jews. And in this pamphlet, a visitor to the Marrano community in Mexico writes that the community feels a connection to Jewish tradition because of, quote, the call of the blood deep-seated in their souls, end quote. Wanting to interrogate this phrase and the author's simultaneous empathy and profound sense of superiority towards this community, I wrote a poem entitled Observant Marranos, which I'll read. Observant Marranos. The call of the blood, you say, and I nod my head, the fall of the blood. But no, you say, the call of the blood, and I nod my head and say, yes, I hear the flowing of blood. And you scream to me the calling of blood, and I call to you the mud. It is falling, blood is failing, all is crawling, and you run off and leave me with this language. The call of mud, the suds we use to wipe clean this blood of the past or this blood of desire. For either we wish for clean blood, purity of hand to foot to race, or we remember the weaving of desire with kind, the desire for a kind, for boxes filled with a kind, 2 kinds at most. The Marranos feel the call of blood back to their people, but aren't they Jews from the start? Yes, the pamphlet says, and no, the author inside and without, a friend and afraid, a cautious touch to those who sing the same songs. Lord of us all, or brown skin, he wonders to himself as he writes to kings and queens for purses of gold. In this poem, I aim to have the language of the past usurp interpretation and overwhelm the reader with a visceral rather than analytical experience of history. The archive, as in this pamphlet, often shocks me in its unabashedness, the stridency which surfaces in its language. To bring this language into the present is to memorialize the past in much the same way a counter-monument self-consciously and performatively memorializes history. Both forms demand an active reckoning from the reader or viewer. The mediums emphasize the importance of the rememberer alongside the remembered and the nearness of history to the present moment, accentuating contemporary responsibility to past injustices. In 2009, scholar Michael Rothberg defined multidirectional memory as the intercultural interaction of historical understandings in order to create a heterogeneous and shifting memory landscape rather than a competitive memory landscape. His model requires simultaneity. Minority groups must remember their experiences and traumas along with those of other groups. Historical poetry, I think, can hold empathy by recording the past multidirectionally, by collapsing time, by placing images and voices side by side. In a poem, traumas can sit next to one another without invoking comparison, causality, or hierarchy, in part because the images and language of these traumas remain elements of the world of the poem, of present-day creation. Belonging to their medium, they retain distinctness or identity as such, as metaphor, description, or rhyme. Poetry can hold simultaneities, especially dissonant ones, in a way in which academic prose, and perhaps even creative prose, cannot. In the preface to his translation of Arthur Rimbaud's Illuminations, John Ashbery wrote, "Absolute modernity was for Rimbaud the acknowledging of the simultaneity of all of life, the condition that nourishes poetry at every second." If a poem can hold the simultaneities of the present, as Ashbery writes, it can also relay those of the past. A poem transmits the ambiguities and multiplicities of historical narratives, the discrepancies between an Inquisition trial transcription and oral histories of crypto-Jews, between expulsion edicts of the Spanish crown and mystical letters written by an exile in a Mexico City jail, like those of Carvajal el Mozo. Contradictions come naturally to the form of a poem, which often holds in balance discordant images and thoughts without providing a clear or single explanation of coherence. A poem can at once relay the domestic and the otherworldly. In the following poem from the collection, also displayed on the screen, images of the past seep into an image of the present, landscapes overlaid in coherence and incoherence. The poet's voice surfaces to join past and present. Okay, and this poem is called Prophetess. I saw the oldest woman in the world die today in Florida, in a pool of blue glass, ice cold, she said. Her browned skin layered in perfect circles like the rings of a lake expanding after interruption. She walked like a swan, toes out, nose up, and it could be Egypt, the desert, a Mexican plaza lined with gold that held her small feet as she shuffled along. The fish, dead, roll beneath in water thin and clear, up from bathhouses and purity cellars, doorways inked with secret symbols, and pig's blood soaking through the floor. A poem can live within the present and past simultaneously, intertwining historical voices with the voice of the poet, who can reveal her process of unearthing the past through content, but also through the form of the poem, its melodies and ruptures, how it lies on the page. The unique tools of the poet, rhyme and rhythm, line and line break, meter, lay bare the skeleton of historical investigation and unveil its decodings. The following poem attempts to articulate this process of discovery and translation, of revealing decodings and uncertainties as the poet approaches the material aspects of the archive. And on the right is a seal that emblematizes the kinds of textures, the materials. There's string in the photo, there's a stamp, there's this wax seal, which I've often found in the archive. And this poem is from a section of the book called Archives Tales, in which I'm thinking about these questions of translation, specifically from the archive's unconscious, the materialities of the archive, into new language, into new poetry. Manuscript. Extended palm, inscribed flower, cross in oval frame. Extend this skin to find ground, minerals beat and barley, fleshed like fables that craft and crawl along slopes, scripts, handwriting scrawls. One came, one leapt before the sun grew tall. Of those who have written these, this renewal, ink and line, is barely pressed under different stamp. Flapping her wings, the dove begins to wail. Can I catch her song as she falls? The collection unfolds into a book concerned with mythology, with new origin myths and archives who listen to our voices, and oral histories from my own family who escaped from Nazi Germany and passed down stories of hiding, holiness, and diaspora. The histories of the Inquisition and the Holocaust are very different, but my roles as translator of the archive, of the Inquisition archive, and translator of my grandfather's stories felt similar. It is this dual act of transmission that the collection and my investigations into poetry and history more broadly aim to unravel. A poem from the final section of the book explores this act of bridging past and present and attempts to make somewhat explicit this process. And it's called Translation. And this is a seal from an Inquisition document. From the top left corner of a microfilm record where it's been digitized but is sort of pressed into a flat screen. So you can see the layers of the pages, but it's a photograph. Translation. At the edge of words, I accompany you, seeing. What you put in this earth comes in letters, parts, apart from what I take, my truth of tradition, ascending, adjacent. Your wisdoms cling, prosper, yet exceed their means. Unable to sieve the past's near ending and my nearing to you. Alphabet gardened, growing. Holding its fullness, I come to provide. Print these knowings and follow your sufferings from where they came. And I think I'll also read, I have one more poem and slide, but before I get to, or a couple slides and one more poem, but before I get to that poem, I think I'll read a poem, which I haven't read at a setting like this before, but for me, it stands perhaps at the center of the collection. It's more rooted to my family histories and my role as translator of my grandfather's stories. And it's called Zeta Rachel. Zeta is grandfather. And it comes from and fictionalizes dialogues that I've had with my grandfather, who I think is watching. And the poem on the page echoes a dialogue in that some of it is in print, and those are the Zeta lines, and some of it is in italics, which are the Rachel lines. So I'll try to sort of change my voice as I go from one to the next so that you can get a sense of what the text looks like. Zeta Rachel. I wonder of God and my good fortunes. Blessed life makes you almost religious. A bridge on Howard Street, along the edge I fell from trees. How tall, how many? And before or since unchanged, my mind, my companion, mine too. I ran through streets to our nanny, got hit by a car, hit my ear, can you see it? In Germany, we were well off with a nanny, man below selling beer, 2 alleys and a moon following. Didn't I have this thought too? Am I like you? Me across alleys. I was smart even then, a blessed life. Since the stroke, I'm sure you're wondering, please, I am not, let's dwell, let's recall. I will tell you all I know of my brain and its tremor. This is how a brain works. Fine, you can explain so I can see you still can. I'll begin logically and end with logical conclusions. Good, good, now back to the cars, cross country, cross ocean, statue from boat's prow, your father and mother, stoics, your laughter, the dishware through glass, cell, border, jail, boat, border. I'll explain from the beginning. I can see you understand. I'll hold these. You are feeding me. I love when you know me as you. I have led a blessed life. You will make much of this world. I wish you will see it. I will conjure like you conjure. Portraits of parents on the walls. They bought this house for its walls. There's something I don't know, will never know. That's as far as I get. You've gone far, farther than I can go. Cannot envy, Rachel, do not envy. Boats, borders, only in your stories. Glass out the window, we are as far as we can get. The Center for Southwest Research at the University of New Mexico is home to many incredible materials, including the fascinating archival materials of Emma Moya, a crypto-Jewish poet, collector, and family historian. And so I wanted to end with a poem dedicated to her and her work. I'll first read this quotation on the screen, which comes from an article she published in 1998. She wrote, "Incredible as it seems, I have learned both the Christian and Jewish versions and found no conflict between them. It is easy for me to state this, as the Inquisition no longer exists. Integration of prayers seems to reflect a historical joining of two similar systems of belief." And this attitude is recurring amongst crypto-Jewish narratives in New Mexico, that there can be an integration without too much conflict between two or more belief systems, that there can be sort of a holding of the multiplicities of identity that crypto-Jews have inherited. And so this poem emerged from a poem by Emma Moya, which was on a piece of paper in the archive, called Ode to the Wandering Swallow's Flight, which is at the bottom of the page over here. And she started her poem, La golondrina siempre está en busca de su nido, or the golondrina is always in search of her nest. And as I mentioned, the swallow, the golondrina, often serves as a symbol of the expelled Jew. And so I wrote this poem, Mother of Exile, in honor of her archive and emerging from this poem of hers that I encountered. Mother of Exile. She is only and always in search of her nest. Little jeweled creatures with tufts on their heads, her babies coo and long for bread. Her babies are emptied like pockets of sea men who abandoned their ships to uncover sand's gray land. Their jackets unravel, bared to old threading. Their hands are unfolding like clams craving shedding. We mourn those who leave us while we are asleep. Unfind those remnants they left us to keep. Bury in earth precious gems for those waking. Gather our sticks to make new what is shaking. She is only and always in search of a nest. As if daybreak were coming and the weary could soon rest, she presses old wind against her small held breath. Thank you. Okay, let's see. I've been told there will be some questions. So just excuse me while I scroll through them for a minute. Let's see. Okay, we have a question from Max Greenberg. I'm curious about how you locate yourself within this research. What resonates for you personally about Converso or crypto-Jewish genealogies? What has your historical inquiries taught you about yourself vis-a-vis your relationship to homelands, expulsion, colonization, diaspora, your own ancestries, etc.? Thank you. Thank you, Max. That's a great question. I think one thing that studying crypto-Jewish history has led me to think a lot about is the absences in our archival records, the absences in our oral histories. And those absences can be found across many different communities reckoning with their pasts. Saidia Hartman writes about the absences in the archive in terms of finding enslaved women's bodies and histories and memories in the archive. Emma Moya and some of the crypto-Jewish poets I work with write a lot about how to approach absence and silence and how to both, as do Chicana poets, how to both hold on to these silences and sort of respect their existence in the archive, respect that there are things we will not know, there are things that are being passed down to us as silence, as absence, and also that these absences are an opportunity to find agency, to dig for oral histories, often for maternal histories that have been pushed aside. And so I think that has been inspirational, this sort of dual act of preserving silence and seeking presence within silences as I do this research and as I approach my family's own oral histories and gather stories from my Zeta, but also from my Baba, my grandmother, my other grandfather and grandmother. Yeah. Great question. Thank you. Let's see. Someone asked about the naming of the Mexican Inquisition, saying maybe it should be called the Spanish. It's a plane. The Spanish Inquisition in New Spain. It is an interesting point because the Spanish tribunal set up offices around the world. It brings to bear an interesting question of how these Inquisition offices related to each other, how they transmitted the statutes of the Inquisition differently in their different colonial contexts amongst different populations. So the question of naming is interesting because it brings to mind the fact that the Inquisition was a global phenomenon and the Spanish and Portuguese empires were transporting the statutes of the Inquisition into very distinct and different colonial contexts. And yes, please, if you have a question, type it in the chat because I can't see anyone. I'll maybe add, while people are thinking, perhaps, one more point to Max's question, how I'm thinking about homeland. I think one fascinating, one thing that has resonated for me as I've studied crypto-Jewish history, really through memory, through oral histories and poems, is how homeland and nostalgia surface in amongst communities who are nostalgically remembering their past versus how nostalgia and homeland functions within nationalistic government narratives of rhetorics of return. And so I think as I work in my scholarship to situate crypto-Judaism within these broader landscapes of identity in the Southwest, I'm very conscientious of how nostalgia, how homeland, how identity construction is a powerful tool amongst communities, and how it can be a distortive tool, as in some of the instances I noted of the Myth of Layaway in Spanish propaganda, Spanish rhetoric from the 1940s up until 1992, up until the citizenship decrees. And so thinking about positionality, specifically in relation to nostalgia, has been something very fruitful that's come from working with the Crypto-Jewish Archive. Let's see. Did you come across a lot of repetition of language in the oral histories, words that kept coming up for people? That's a great question. There was recently an article published by Dalia Candioti and Rina Ben Mayor, and they've been collecting oral histories of people applying for Spanish citizenship, so that it would also be an interesting question in that context. In the oral histories that I've encountered, I think the myth of Layaway occurred very frequently, which is why it's sort of become one emblem of how I approach this history and this memory construction. I think also words like mythology, words like memory, notions of secretness, of rumor and gossip, specifically from family members. I think I often come across repeated tones of people sort of proudly reclaiming ancestry or stringing together nodes in their lineages, as well as attempts to sort of hold multiplicities of identity, or to situate Jewish identity within the identities that they've grown up with, that they're more accustomed to. And I also, this is not exactly the question, but there's also a lot of repetition of the language of Inquisition materials, of autos de fe, of these Inquisition trial records, which is really where the book began, is that I was coming up against so many sort of formalities in Inquisition documents, so much language that's repeated and has a sort of emptiness to it, although it's an emptiness, but also very emblematic of politics of power and structures of the Spanish Empire as they crafted their Inquisition language, this sort of world of language that encompassed the Inquisition. And so the repetition in those colonial sources really stood out to me and was very strange, and was one of the first impulses, my first impulse to approach this material often came through that repeated language. Let's see. Were there any particular words, phrases, or texts that were particularly challenging or interesting to translate? That's a good question. I would say in general, Inquisition records are extraordinarily hard to translate in their entirety, and some scholars have done the work before me, which is wonderful to be able to approach translations of materials alongside originals. But those documents are written, as we saw in the Carvajal record, in this scrawling script, which is interesting in terms of the materiality of the archive, thinking about someone like Susan Howe and her approach to handwriting, and to that which is not discernible in the archive. But the handwriting is difficult, and the language is archaic and twists around itself. And as I was mentioning, it's contained within this very formal, sort of staged and performative language of the Inquisition. So I would say colonial Spanish records, specifically Inquisition records, have been very challenging to approach and to translate.
Gorgeous. Well, thank you so much for this amazing experience and talk, Rachel. On behalf of all of our attendees, on behalf of those who are excited to watch it on YouTube and AJHS, thank you for giving your time this evening, your beautiful words and work and research into this really fascinating topic. We're so happy to host you tonight.